One of the most powerful sentences on the internet is also one of the most confusing. Everything is energy. It sounds deep, it sounds spiritual, it sounds scientific, and because it sounds all three at once, people rarely stop to ask the most important question: what does that actually mean? Because most of the time, when people use the word energy, they are not talking about one thing. They are mixing together physical energy, emotional energy, motivation, nervous system state, vibration, presence, and sometimes even money. And once all of that gets blended into one vague word, clarity disappears. That confusion becomes expensive, because the moment people stop defining their terms, they start making bad conclusions. They hear everything is energy, and suddenly that becomes, if I raise my energy, money will come. If I feel off, I'm blocking abundance. If my life isn't working, my vibration must be wrong. If I think better, I'll instantly change outcomes. That sounds empowering at first, but after a while it often becomes exhausting, because vague spiritual language can make people feel like they are constantly failing some invisible test. Instead of building clarity, they build guilt. Instead of improving their life, they keep trying to fix their energy without even knowing what that means. So today we're going to clean this up, not with hype, not with mystical language, with precision, because that's what vibrational state is about. Taking concepts that sound spiritual, abstract, or even scientific, and translating them into something real and usable. Before we go deeper, if you want grounded videos on vibration, emotional frequency, coherence, and the inner field, subscribe now. Each episode builds on the last. And this one matters because if your definitions are wrong, everything built on top of them becomes unstable. Now, here's the first big insight. The phrase, everything is energy, becomes dangerous when people use it without defining what layer they're talking about, because there are at least 3 different layers hiding inside that sentence. First, physical energy. Second, emotional energy. Third, frequency, meaning the state you repeatedly return to. Those are not the same thing. And when people confuse them, they start using physics words to explain emotional patterns. That's where things go off track. So let's begin with the most basic layer. In physics, energy is measurable. It has specific meaning. It relates to motion, heat, work, transfer, stored potential. It is not a mindset. It is not a mood. It is not a spiritual vibe. So when someone says quantum energy as if that phrase alone explains why their life is stuck, it may sound intelligent. But very often, it explains almost nothing, because words that sound advanced are not the same as words that are accurate. And the less precise the language becomes, the easier it is to avoid the real issue. That's why this topic matters so much, because clarity is not boring. Clarity is power. Clarity helps you stop chasing mystery and start changing patterns. And once you separate physical energy from emotional state, so much confusion disappears. Let's make this practical. Imagine someone says, "My energy is off." What do they usually mean? They usually do not mean, "My measurable physical energy field has changed in a scientifically validated way that predicts my bank balance." What they usually mean is something much more human. They mean, "I feel anxious. I feel drained. I feel scattered. I feel heavy. I feel disconnected. I feel overwhelmed." That experience is real, but it is not physics. It is emotional state. And this is where the second big insight appears. Spiritual language becomes useful the moment you translate it into behavior. For example, if someone says, "My energy is low," that may sound vague, but translated into real life, it could mean they didn't sleep well. Their nervous system is overstimulated. They are carrying background tension. They are overthinking. They are avoiding one important decision. They are leaking attention into too many places. Now we are no longer floating in abstract language. Now we are talking about patterns. And patterns can be changed. This is exactly why so many people stay stuck when they consume spiritual content. Not because the ideas are always wrong, but because the language stays too vague. And vague language gives people emotional relief without giving them real direction. They say, "My energy is blocked." But what does that actually mean? Does it mean you're afraid of a conversation? You're avoiding numbers? You're checking your phone all day? You're rushing? You're sleeping badly? You're emotionally overloaded? Those are very different things, and each one creates different results. So when everything gets reduced to energy, people lose access to the real cause. Now here's where vibrational state takes a different path. We don't stop at the vague word. We translate it. Because the useful question is never just, "How is my energy?" The useful question is, "What is my state creating in my behavior?" That's what matters, because emotional energy matters deeply. Not because it magically controls reality, but because it changes attention, perception, choices, timing, consistency. Now let's look at a simple example. Two people walk into the same room. One says, "The energy in there felt terrible." What might that actually mean? It might mean they sensed tension, their body felt unsafe, their attention narrowed, their nervous system shifted into defense. The room may have had tension, yes, but their experience of that room was also shaped by their internal state. Another person may walk into the same room and say, "It felt completely normal." Same room, different system, different interpretation. That matters, because people often talk about energy as if it were always out there. But many times what they are really describing is the interaction between the external environment and their internal condition. That's huge, because it shifts the question from, "What energy is outside of me?" to, "What state am I bringing into this moment?" And once you ask that, life becomes more workable. Now let's connect this directly to prosperity. A person says, "My money energy is bad." That sounds spiritual, but translated into behavior, it may mean they avoid checking numbers, they feel panic when money comes up, they make rushed decisions, they overspend for relief, they undercharge from fear, they start systems and abandon them. That is not a mystical mystery. That is a pattern. And patterns create outcomes. So again, physical energy is one thing, emotional state is another. And frequency, in the way vibrational state uses it, is the repeated state that shapes the way you live. That is where the word vibration becomes useful. Not when it sounds mystical, when it becomes specific. Now let's go one layer deeper. The internet often tells people, "Raise your energy." But if that phrase is never defined, people usually do one of two things. Either they fake positivity, or they blame themselves when nothing changes. Both are traps. Because forced positivity is not coherence, and self-blame is not growth. This is where the third big insight appears. The useful word is not energy. The useful word is coherence, because coherence asks a better question. It does not ask, "Do I feel amazing right now?" It asks, "Are my thoughts, emotions, body, and behavior aligned enough to create a clean signal?" That is a much better target, because life does not reward emotional performance. Life responds to patterns. So let's make this real. Example 1. Money. Someone says, "I want abundance, but I have bad energy around money." Translated into real behavior, that may mean they avoid their finances, they panic when they look, they make short-term choices, they feel guilty receiving, they fear charging properly, they sabotage consistency. That is not a mystical curse, that is incoherence. Now example 2. Work. Someone says, "My energy is too low to move forward." But what's actually happening? Maybe they are overstimulated, sleep-deprived, trying to do 10 things at once, flooded by noise, unable to hold steady attention. Again, the more useful question is not, "How do I raise my energy?" It is, "How do I reduce noise and restore coherence?" Because coherence is what supports clean action. Example 3. Manifestation. Someone says, "I'm trying to manifest, but my energy keeps dropping. What often happens next? One day they feel inspired, the next day they feel discouraged, then motivated again, then doubtful again. That emotional instability creates unstable behavior, and unstable behavior cannot compound. This is one of the most important lessons in prosperity work. You do not need a constant emotional high. You need a stable enough baseline to repeat clean actions over time. That is what high vibration really means in practical life. Not floating through the day in forced positivity, but building enough steadiness that your body, emotions, and behavior stop fighting each other. That's coherence, and coherence creates signal. Now, why do people prefer vague energy language? Because it sounds easier. It sounds like if you can just feel the right feeling, life will rearrange itself. But real prosperity usually asks for something less dramatic and more powerful. Clarity, stability, attention, patience, and repeated clean decisions. That may sound less exciting than mystical language, but it works. And that is why Vibrational State focuses so much on emotional frequency, because emotional frequency is not about peak feelings, it's about the baseline you repeatedly return to. If your baseline is urgency, your life becomes urgent. If your baseline is steadiness, your life becomes more coherent. And over time, coherence compounds. That's why frequency matters, not because it replaces work, because it shapes the quality of work, the consistency of work, and the signal behind the work. So let's close this with something useful. Here is a simple anti-woo filter you can use anytime someone says, "Everything is energy." Ask yourself 4 questions. First, are they talking about physics or emotion? Second, can this idea be translated into behavior? Third, does this reduce shame and increase clarity? Fourth, does this help me build coherence, or does it just sound deep? If it only sounds deep, it will probably keep you stuck. If it builds coherence, it can change your life. Now, this is not a guided exercise episode, but Vibrational State will always mention tools, because coherence is trainable. Here are a few grounded tools. Tool 1. Reduce attention leakage. Too much input creates internal noise. Tool 2. Reduce background tension. Jaw, shoulders, belly. These shape your signal more than most people realize. Tool 3. Simplify decisions. Chaos destroys coherence. Tool 4. Take 1 clean action, not 10 emotional ones. 1 clean one. Tool 5. Translate vague words into real words. Not, "My energy is blocked," but "I'm overwhelmed. I'm avoiding this decision. I'm rushing. I'm afraid of the next step." That translation alone can change everything, because language shapes perception, and perception shapes behavior. Now let's summarize the whole episode clearly. Physical energy is real, measurable, and part of physics. Emotional energy is a human experience, real, but not the same thing as physics. Frequency, in vibrational state, is the state you repeatedly return to. That state becomes your baseline. That baseline becomes your inner field, and your inner field shapes your actions, decisions, and outcomes. So stop mixing the layers, stop using vague language when what you need is clarity, and stop asking, "How do I raise my energy?" when the more useful question is, "What pattern am I repeating?" Because patterns compound, and patterns shape your life more reliably than slogans ever will. In the next episode, we'll go into one of the most famous and misunderstood physics experiments of all, the double-slit experiment, what it actually teaches, and what it definitely does not. If you want to keep building this understanding step by step, subscribe. Welcome to Vibrational State.